M-Trends 2026, what 450,000 hours of incident response actually tells us. So Mandiant just released M-Trends 2026, and it's built on over 450,000 hours of incident response engagements. Not survey data, not vendor projections. This is what investigators actually found on the ground across hundreds of real-world breaches. And several of the findings this year challenge assumptions the industry is still operating on. For example, global median dwell time went up from 11 to 14 days. Exploitation remained the top initial access vector for the sixth straight year, and voice phishing exploded onto the scene as the second most common way attackers get in. I wrote a full breakdown of this on Resilient Cyber, and I want to walk through the findings that matter most. Because in a world where exploitation times have gone negative, the data in this report tells you exactly where the gaps are. So let's look at where the numbers and how they define the landscape. Let's start with initial access. Exploits remained the #1 initial infection vector for the sixth consecutive year. They accounted for over 32% of intrusions. That's important context when people talk about phishing being the primary threat. It's not. And it hasn't been for 6 years running according to Mandiant's data. But here's the finding that should change how the industry thinks about social engineering. Voice phishing, or called vishing, surged to 11%, making it the second most common initial infection vector in 2025. Meanwhile, traditional email phishing collapsed from 14% in 2024 to just 6%. The attack surface didn't shrink, it shifted. These aren't spray and pray email campaigns anymore. These are live, interactive operations where attackers call employees directly, impersonate IT help desks, and walk people through handing over credentials or installing remote access tools. Mandiant specifically ties this to groups like UNC 3944, or called Scattered Spider. They've been targeting help desk staff and impersonating employees requesting password resets and MFA changes. The social engineering game has gone fully interactive. Most organizations' security awareness training simply hasn't caught up. Next, let's dig into dwell time, the nuance behind the numbers. Dwell time, for example. The global median dwell time increased to 14 days, up from 11 days just the prior year, and 10 days the year before that. At first glance, that looks like a regression. But Mandiant is clear about what's driving it. This isn't defenders getting slower, it's the composition of intrusions are shifting. More of Mandiant's 2024 caseload involves state-sponsored espionage actors, groups that are purpose-built for stealth. These are intrusions that sit undetected for months or even years, and they pull up the median numbers. In fact, Mandiant documented multi-year intrusions involving Chinese nexus groups operating on edge devices and network infrastructure where actors hadn't been present for in some time. The detection source data tells the real story. Internal detection jumped from 43% to 52% of cases. That's a meaningful improvement. External entity notifications dropped from 43% to 34%, and adversary notifications, mostly ransom notes, held steady at 14%. But here's what matters most. Internal detection dwell time actually improved, going from 10 days to 9 days. Externally notified intrusions saw dwell time jump from 11 to 25 days. And Mandiant notes that the median dwell time for incidents motivated by cyber espionage and DPRK IT operations, for example, was 122 days, about 4 months. That gap tells you exactly where intrusions are pulling the global median up. The ones where attackers aren't making noise is purpose-built for persistence. One of the most significant findings in this year's report is the focus on edge device exploitation. Mandiant calls it out explicitly. Threat actors, particularly China nexus groups, are systematically targeting firewalls, VPN appliances, and network edge infrastructure as their preferred persistent mechanism. And the reason is straightforward. These devices typically lack endpoint detection and have limited logging and often can't run traditional security agents. The report documents campaigns where attackers deployed custom malware ecosystems on compromised edge devices, things such as rootkits, backdoors, tunnelers, and maintained access across firmware updates and even device replacements in some cases. We're talking about persistence mechanisms that survive the remediation steps that most organizations would take. This connects to something I've been writing about for a while, the gap between where we deploy our best detection and where adversaries are actually operating. For example, we've invested heavily in endpoint security for workstations and servers. Meanwhile, attackers are pivoting to the network edge, where virtualized infrastructure, such as VMware, ESXi, and to the identity layer. The M-Trends data validates that this isn't an isolated incident, but a broader trend. How about cloud identity and the emerging threats? The cloud findings reinforce a pattern I keep coming back to. In cloud-specific intrusions, the initial access distribution looks completely different from the global numbers. Voice phishing was the #1 cloud initial infection vector at 23%, followed by third-party compromise at 17%, stolen credentials at 16%, and insider threat at 14%. Exploits, the top vector globally, accounted for only 6% of cloud compromises. That tells you that cloud attack surfaces are fundamentally an identity and social engineering problem. Mandiant also documented attackers abusing non-human identities. Think service accounts, API keys, OAuth tokens, and compromising SaaS providers to reach their downstream targets. In cloud environments, arguments, identity is the perimeter, and the report makes clear that attackers understand this better than most defenders do. Mandiant also dedicated significant coverage to DPRK IT worker operations, which we've seen a lot in the news headlines over the past year. North Korean operatives using fabricated identities to secure remote IT positions at Western companies. Once inside, they exfiltrate proprietary data, generate revenue for the regime, and what started as a revenue operation has evolved into a full insider threat vector. And the report shows it's operating at a scale most organizations haven't internalized quite yet. And then, of course, there's AI. Mandiant documents adversaries are using AI to accelerate social engineering, shifting from static phishing campaigns to hyper-personalized voice-based attacks, and even deploying malware that queries large language models mid-execution to adapt to behavior. On the defensive side, the report raises something I've been vocal about: the risk of vibe coding, where AI-generated code introduces vulnerabilities that developers accept without adequate review. It's a supply chain risk hiding in plain sight. So what does all this mean, and what should we take away from it? Here's what I took away from M-Trends 2026. The threat landscape isn't just evolving, it's restructuring. Exploitation timelines have gone negative, attackers are living on edge devices where our detection doesn't reach, and social engineering has gone from email blasts to phone calls that walk employees through their own compromise. And identity, human and non-human, is the attack surface that keeps expanding. The organizations getting this right are the ones treating detection and response as a continuous, intelligence-driven function, not a quarterly exercise. They're extending visibility to edge infrastructure and cloud identity layers, not just endpoints. They're also building response capabilities that assume sophisticated actors will get in and focusing on minimizing the damage when they do. So I go much deeper on all of this in my write-up on Resilient Cyber, the specific campaigns, the cloud and identity dynamics, the AI implications. All of this is on Resilient Cyber if you want to dig into the link in the description below. M-Trends remains one of the most valuable primary sources in our industry because it's based on what actually happened, not what vendors want to sell you. I'd highly recommend reading the full report, and the link is in the description for those that want to check it out. Thanks for watching.